All right, ready to dive in. Today we're going to untangle something, well, kind of tricky. We're talking about borderline personality disorder, BPD for short, and how it gets kind of messy when it overlaps with, narcissistic traits. And before anyone freaks out, no, we're not saying they're the same thing, not at all. It's more like, think of a Venn diagram.
Right.
We're interested in that overlapping bit in the middle. That's where things get really interesting, especially in relationships. We've got research here, piles of it actually, looking at how this whole interplay of BPD and these narcissistic traits, how it affects, well, everyone involved, not just the person with BPD.
It's complex, for sure. And honestly, isn't it more about understanding the why behind what people do rather than just slapping labels on everything?
Way more interesting. So picture this. You're scrolling online, right? And you see someone just pouring their heart out, like constantly, always looking for validation. Easy to think attention-seeking, right? But what if that's actually a sign of something deeper, something common in BPD?
Because with BPD, there's this emptiness. Chronic emptiness. It's like a void they can't fill. So yeah, those outward behaviors, often it's not really about the attention, it's trying to find something, some sense of worth externally, because it feels impossible to find it internally.
So less about being self-centered, more like terrified of not being the center, because they don't have that core sense of self.
Exactly. And think about how early childhood plays into this. If someone grows up without that steady, loving connection, that need for security goes unmet. And that can show up as intense fear of abandonment, rejection, all that in adult relationships.
So if their sense of self is already shaky, how do they even experience being themselves,
Imagine looking in a mirror, but the reflection is always changing. One minute you get praise, it's a temporary high.
Yeah.
Criticism, total crash into self-loathing. That's where BPD and those narcissistic traits get so tangled up. It's painful.
Because they're desperate for validation, but any criticism just wrecks them.
It's a tough cycle. And look, people with BPD aren't trying to be difficult. It's this thing called emotional dysregulation. Basically, their emotions are on overdrive. They can't just dial it down.
And they can't just get over it either.
Right. And then add on those narcissistic traits where it's all about needing admiration. Relationships become a high wire act,
More like walking a tightrope during an earthquake, am I right? No wonder it's chaotic. But we're going to get into all that, how it actually plays out for partners right after this. So we talked about what's going on inside, with BPD, that emptiness, the struggles. But what's it actually like for the person who's dating someone with BPD? How does it show up for them?
Well, imagine a roller coaster, but instead of just ups and downs, it's love and adoration one minute, then distance and anger the next. Almost like whiplash, emotionally. Our sources use that term a lot, actually.
Intense, right. And it's not like a one-time ride. It's their relationship day in and day out. Makes sense that partners end up feeling confused, exhausted. Like, is it even possible to get your balance when that's the constant back and forth?
Yeah.
And it's tough because, well, like you said before, it's not like the person with BPD is choosing to act this way.
Exactly. We can't forget that. It's not about blaming anyone. It's about understanding the impact this dynamic has. Partners start questioning themselves, their own reality. That's rough.
Walking on eggshells 24/7. It's no wonder our sources talk about this emotional caregiving trap. You love someone, you want to support them, so you end up trying to manage their feelings, be their therapist almost.
And that's where it gets messy, right?
Yeah.
Because as much as you love them, you can't fix BPD. You're not supposed to. So you pour all this energy into caregiving, it takes over the whole relationship. Resentment builds, everyone burns out.
One article had this example that really stuck with me. This partner was so used to anticipating every trigger, trying to keep things calm, they completely forgot about their own needs. Resentment just festered until the whole thing was toxic.
And that's the key point, isn't it? It's not that relationships can't work when BPD is involved, but you need awareness, healthy ways of coping, open communication. Otherwise, both people get stuck.
So how do we get unstuck? Because thankfully, our sources aren't all doom and gloom. There are actual strategies, right? Things people can do.
Absolutely. And it starts with realizing that communication, it's not just about talking more in this case, it's about talking differently.
Talking differently. Right, because sometimes how you say something is just as important as what you're saying.
100%. And our sources, they keep coming back to this thing called I statements.
I statement. Seems kind of basic, right? Like first-year psych stuff. But I guess there's a reason they're so common. It's because they actually work.
They can be game changers, honestly, especially in these relationships where BPD is a factor. It's about shifting the whole vibe, from blame to, hey, this is my experience. So instead of, you always make me feel, which, let's be real, we all want to say it sometimes, but it just makes things worse, usually.
So what, you just rephrase it?
Yeah. It's like, I feel, instead of you always.
Hmm.
Subtle, but powerful.
So the person with BPD, do they actually hear it differently then?
It creates space, you know? If you're already scared of being rejected, being accused just pushes you further away. But I feel it invites empathy, and even if the emotion itself is tough to hear, the approach is different.
Instead of a punch, it's more like extending a hand.
Yes. And there was this example in one of the articles, really practical. Imagine a partner who's feeling ignored, right? Like their needs are invisible. Instead of saying, you never listen, which just starts a fight, they try, I feel hurt and unimportant when I feel like I'm not being heard.
Oh, wow. That hits different. Yeah.
Right. It's not about attacking the other person. It's about communicating what you're going through.
Building a bridge instead of a wall. I like it.
Exactly. And speaking of avoiding explosions, our sources also talk about this pause technique.
Hitting the brakes when things get too intense. Seems counterintuitive, but I'm listening.
It's so tempting to just power through, try to win the argument or whatever. But this pause technique is about realizing, okay, this is getting out of hand, and agreeing to take a break before things get really bad.
So not storming out in a huff, but more like a mutually agreed upon timeout.
Yes. It could even sound as simple as, I'm getting overwhelmed. Can we pause this for like 20 minutes, come back when we both chilled out a bit?
Giving yourself permission to tap out for a minute, especially with emotional dysregulation making it hard to, think straight when you're in it.
It's a reset button for the whole system. You both calm down, then you can actually work through the problem instead of just reacting. And that actually leads us to another big one, boundaries.
Boundaries. Everyone loves to talk about boundaries, but I feel like when it comes to BPD, no one's quite sure what healthy boundaries even look like.
Right. It's a minefield. But our sources were very clear about this. Boundaries aren't about punishing anyone or controlling them. They're about respect. Both ways.
But how do you even start setting those boundaries? Especially with someone who's already terrified of being abandoned, any little thing feels like rejection.
It starts with you remembering that your feelings are valid, you're allowed to have limits, and you can communicate those limits respectfully, but firmly. Like one source talked about this partner who felt unsafe when their partner with BPD would yell during arguments. That's legit. That's a boundary right there.
Totally. But how do you actually say that without making it worse? Stop yelling. Never really goes well.
Oh, yeah, good point. It's all in the delivery.
Yeah.
It's more like, hey, when you yell at me, it makes me feel unsafe. I need you to talk to me calmly, even when we're disagreeing. You're not saying they're a bad person. You're saying this specific behavior makes you feel a certain way.
It's amazing how much of this comes down to communication. But even if you're like a communication ninja, this is tough stuff. And one thing I really appreciate is that our sources don't pretend like anyone has to do this alone. They talk a lot about getting support.
Because trying to deal with this all by yourselves, that's like, I don't know, climbing Mount Everest in a blizzard. Maybe possible, but dangerous and probably dumb. So yeah, therapy, individually and together, can be huge. And outside of that, friends, family, support groups, it's like a safety net, so you don't feel like the whole weight of this is just on you.
Because it's not about fixing each other. It's more like you're building a stronger foundation together so you can actually handle the weight.
Exactly. It's about making the whole system more stable, which helps everyone involved.
And speaking of foundations, our sources actually had this really interesting bit about shared hobbies, right? Like doing things together, but not putting so much pressure on the romantic relationship itself.
Yes. It's easy to fall into this trap where the relationship has to be everything, especially when BPD is involved. But that's too much for any one relationship to handle. It's like those old pressure cookers. Something's going to blow eventually.
Gotta let off some steam.
Right. So hobbies, going for walks, having game nights with friends, whatever it is, it takes some of that pressure off.
Yeah.
You're connecting in a different way, having fun that doesn't depend on solving all your problems as a couple.
It's not about avoiding the hard stuff. It's about having other outlets so it doesn't become all-consuming.
Exactly. It brings more balance, and everyone benefits from that.
It feels like the more you understand about BPD, especially where it intersects with those narcissistic tendencies, the better equipped you are to actually navigate it. Knowledge really is power.
It really is.
Yeah.
Because when you understand the why behind what people do, you can be more compassionate, more patient, and that makes a world of difference.
Well, we've covered a lot today, but it's really just the beginning, isn't it? I hope what folks take away from this deep dive is that understanding all this, it's not a finish line, it's a journey. And you don't have to go it alone.
Nope, not at all. We're all figuring it out as we go. And sometimes just knowing that can make things a little easier.
Absolutely. Now, our sources brought up this fascinating point about how people with BPD often really crave deep connection, but they're also terrified of it at the same time. So here's something to think about. How can we, as partners, friends, family, how can we show up in a way that makes them feel safe and encourages them to grow? That's the question to keep exploring. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We love having you here. Catch you next time.